It's something that we always suspected, this tilt that this administration had towards Russia, but writing it writing it in an unclassified document and putting
Yeah.
it out, that was a surprise.
Donald Trump's new US Secretary strategy warned US security strategy even warns Europe that they're facing a civilizational erasure. The strategy talks about cultivating resistance to restore former greatness across the continent, warning that certain NATO members will become majority non-European in a matter of years. It echoes some of the comments made by US Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference in February.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America.
Well, I'm joined now by Jim Townsend, former US Assistant Secretary for Europe and NATO. Jim, good afternoon.
Well, good afternoon.
Well, I'm sure you've read this 33-page report cover to cover. So what stood out most for you?
Well, it's you can't read it just once. You have to read it over and over. And even then, of course, you come up with just question marks. But I guess the first thing to say is that the administrations develop these national security strategies, and then there's a national defense strategy, which talks about that implementation, and then there's a global posture review, which talks about U.S. forces around the globe, and is that where we want these forces deployed? And so there's a history to this, and frankly, the history mostly has been these strategies when they're released don't say a lot. There's a lot of puffery in them and politics in them, and people really don't pay too much attention to them except in the think tanks for a couple of weeks. But this one, I think, is for the history books, and this one really lays bare. It's not an ideology, but it's a world outlook that they really seem to be following ever since they came into power. It's not something to just wrap fish in. This is going to be something that really does lay out the way they look at the world, even though they won't be successful necessarily in implementing what they say. They're laying it out for everyone to see, and very bluntly.
Yeah, I mean, the German foreign minister has reacted by saying it doesn't need outside advice on domestic development. But the idea of the US cultivating resistance, that's the direct quote. I mean, what does that actually mean? And that's the opposite of the long established policy of non-intervention in other people's politics.
Well, it is, and particularly intervention in their allies' politics. I mean, this is horrible. I guess what it means is providing assistance to those civil groups and political entities that espouse, the worldview similar to the administration's, I guess. But I just when J.D. Vance gave his speech at Munich, it was hard to understand. Okay, we hear what you're saying. Now, what are you going to do about it? And this is the same thing. How do you do this kind of influence, except what we used to do against the Soviet Union? The civil affairs groups giving them money. But why are we doing this? Why do we feel this is something that we have to do? This is politics of the rawest source. And I just don't understand the thinking why this has got to be done. I don't think we're going to be very good at it, and I think it's going to be obvious when we do it. But it's just a thing where I'm going to have to see if in fact they're serious about doing something along these lines.
And do you spot J.D. Vance's hand behind this document? I mean, it seems to be sort of written through it like a stick of rock.
Absolutely, absolutely. J.D. Vance, he doesn't come up all that often in foreign and defense policy. It's been other people, Marco Rubio or Hegseth at the Pentagon. And every now and then J.D. Vance will say something, but I think he's very much the hidden hand behind this and things going on with the Ukraine-Russia negotiations and this type of thing. And while we're on that, I just want to say that I have never seen in black and white a policy towards Russia the way it has been written in this document. It's something that we always suspected, this tilt that this administration had towards Russia, but writing it in an unclassified document and putting it out, that was a surprise.
Well, and that line on NATO, ending the perception and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. I mean, that is straight from Russia, isn't it? That's a Russian line. What does this mean that the US is now spouting Russian rhetoric and propaganda, really?
Well, I think it's not only are they espousing that, but I think they believe it. I think it's a coincidence that the Russians also think that way too. I think in terms of NATO enlargement itself as a policy, this administration is finished with it. Because it hit up against Georgia and Ukraine. It sparked off these problems, and now the administration says NATO back off from enlargement. It's gone too far. It's causing trouble, and in saying that, it is exactly music to the ears of those in the Kremlin for sure.
Jim Townsend, thank you so much for joining us. Former US Assistant Secretary for Europe and NATO there.
Russian President Vladimir Putin challenged heavy U.S. pressure on India not to buy Russian fuel if the U.S. could do so. Putin is in New Delhi for a two-day state visit. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi received Putin at the airport, where they embraced on the red carpet and then drove away in the same vehicle. Putin spoke in comments to Indian broadcaster India Today.
As for India's purchases, or purchase of energy resources from Russia, well, I would like to note and have already mentioned this publicly once. The US itself still buys nuclear fuel from us for its own nuclear power plants. That is also fuel, uranium for the reactors operating in the United States. If the US has the right to buy our fuel, why shouldn't India have the same privilege? This question deserves thorough examination, and we stand ready to discuss it, including with President Trump.
Putin's comments come as India's crude imports are set to hit a 3-year low this month following U.S. tariffs on Indian goods and tightening of sanctions on Russia. U.S. President Donald Trump's administration says India's purchases of cheap Russian oil help finance Moscow's war in Ukraine. The U.S. and European Union, however, continue to import billions of dollars worth of Russian energy and commodities, ranging from liquefied natural gas to enriched uranium. Putin's first visit to India in 4 years aims to increase sales of Russian oil, missile systems and fighter jets, and widen business links beyond energy and defense equipment. New Delhi and Moscow have strong ties going back to the days of the former Soviet Union, and Russia has been the main source of arms for India for decades. The two leaders will hold summit talks on Friday when they are expected to announce a raft of deals. India and Russia aim to raise two-way trade to $100 billion by 2030.